Bonjour, bonsoir. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Je vais essayer d'être bref. Je m'appelle Atalio, je suis le fondateur de l'association Dumbanengue. Je vais commencer par dire quelques mots sur Dumbanengue et sur ce qui nous amène au MEG ce soir. Je remercierai nos partenaires et je vais conclure en partageant un texte que j'ai écrit pour l'occasion. Dumbanengue est un mot Shangaan, langue parlée au sud du Mozambique et en partie en Afrique du Sud. Ça signifie faire confiance à ses propres pieds. Dumbanengue est donc une association fondée et basée ici à Genève et qui est dédiée à la production, à la diffusion et à la promotion des musiques électroniques sud-africaines. Notre mission est de créer des ponts entre les scènes culturelles suisses et sud-africaines, en donnant de la visibilité aux artistes issus des communautés noires et queer d'ici et de là-bas. Dumbanengue, c'est aussi un espace de réflexion et d'écoute, comme ce soir. Cette table ronde est le résultat de 3 années de réflexion, d'essais, d'erreurs, de pauses, de reprises et de collaboration. Merci spécialement à Thelma et à Sanélé de faire partie de cette construction. Je tiens à remercier celles et ceux qui ont rendu cette rencontre possible, la ville de Genève, Pro Helvetia, l'Abri et le MEG. Merci beaucoup pour votre confiance. Je voudrais maintenant partager un texte que j'ai écrit pour cette rencontre. Dans l'ombre de la nuit, nos ancêtres inspirent, rêves ardents. Au matin effacé par le soleil artificiel, néon blanc. La machine se réveille, diamant poli par des points liés, sans repos, sans lumière, sous l'occupation des corps. Corps brisés, corps pressés, corps lacérés, corps jetés. Colonie des esprits. Toile sanglante sur mur immaculé, ou pas si immaculé. Noire la création, blanche la main qui prend. Le cri sans le prix. Rien à foutre du prix. Le son né des ténèbres n'est pas à vendre. Le son né des ténèbres n'est pas à vendre. Le son né des ténèbres n'est pas à vendre. Le cri sans le prix. Avec le prix vient le silence, noir et blanc. Tous broyés par le profit. Marché qui dévore. Offrande sonore, dépouillés par des oreilles trop souvent étrangères à leur langue. Et pourtant, ça résonne encore. Un battement, un souffle, un son qui résiste. Attention, voilà la lumière. Silence. Merci. Maintenant, je vais donner la parole à Izzy, qui est DJ, curatrice militante culturelle basée à Zurich et qui va se charger de la modération de cette discussion.
Thank you very much, Lito. I'm touched. And I guess you put us all in the right vibe to start the discussion on Black Sound, White Ears. Let me present to you our panelists. On my left is Lene Denise, writer, DJ, and cultural theorist based between Amsterdam and Johannesburg. She coined the term DJ scholarship, reframing the DJ as an activist and cultural worker, exploring Black diasporic memory, queer history, and sound system culture as living archives Lene is also represented in the Afrosonica exhibition. You can see her work in the back. To my right sits Dormant Youth, Thelma Ndebele, Joburg-based interdisciplinary artist, DJ and architect, founder of the Groove Biennale. Their work examines queer nightlife as a form of world building and uses DJ performance as spatial research. And to the left again sits Jamal Nkledlana, visual artist and cultural worker, founder of Bubblegum Club and Bubblegum Gallery, and founding member of the CUSS group. His work explores Black embodiment, subcultures, fashion, and post-colonial identity in Joburg, with exhibitions internationally, including Data Tapestries that was shown in Amsterdam this summer. Yeah, maybe you stumbled over it. Platforms like Spotify call Durban the mother of music and built entire marketing campaigns around sounds like gqom and amapiano. Yet, Spotify pays artists like fractions of a cent per stream, so virtually nothing. We cannot ignore this. Yeah, and that's why tonight's conversation is not neutral. It is a space to ask hard questions like, who profits when South African electronic music travels? Who controls the narrative when it goes global? And what do we as artists, curators, and listeners owe to the communities that created these sounds in the first place? To start off, I would like to ask each of you to please share your personal, artistic, and/or intellectual connection to Black South African electronic music. Lene, can I ask you to start?
Okay, yes. Thank you for the introduction and for Atalio to kind of set the tone and think about darkness, extraction, and light. Hello, can you all hear me? Can you hear me? I was saying thank you for the words and for the introduction and for that sort of important framing. Thank you all both. I am Lene Denise. I am originally from Los Angeles, California, but I have lived in many cities from Detroit to Brooklyn to Atlanta to Nashville to Montreal to London, Amsterdam, and Johannesburg. And I'm 50 years old. I share that because I focus on the 1980s as a really important kind of fertile ground to think about the rise of neoliberalism, which I am framing as kind of a political and economic system that was kind of situated by Reaganomics and Thatcherism. And I think about the 80s as a critical time for understanding African diasporic electronic music. And so someone who was born and raised in LA, and growing up on underground radio, I had access to tons of hip hop, mainly East Coast hip hop, and we didn't have the presence of house on local radio stations. And so I found house during my travels, house music in particular. And as it relates to South Africa and my personal relationship, I mean, I want to be clear about the fact that there were many anti-apartheid movements happening globally, but certainly in LA. And so, say, for example, when Nelson Mandela was released, my family took me to hear him speak. And hearing him speak, I made an association with Hugh Masekela, who was in the US, and also Miriam Makeba. And so my connection to South African electronic music comes through those two, and the relationship between Nina Simone and Miriam Makeba. But I went to Durban in 2001, and I kept hearing this sound, and to me it was like a slowed down version of house music. And I was asking local folks who were, taking me around in a taxi what this sound was, and it turns out that it was kwaito. And so my introduction into South African electronic music comes through visiting Durban for the first time and then hearing kwaito in the taxis. So, yes.
Thank you. Jamal, would you like to continue taking us into your musical perspective?
Yes, definitely. So my name is Jamal Ngledlana. I'm from Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm based in Geneva now since December 2024. And I was born in 1985 in Durban in South Africa. So at the time, bubblegum music was, I would say, at its peak. So I sort of grew up with the sound of bubblegum playing. And then as I grew, I would say, to become more conscious, kwaito was the sound that was present. And I guess that's like the first sound I would say I came to love, because I actually came to love bubblegum music after the fact. So grew up with kwaito, and that was the dominant sound. Outside of kwaito, I was also introduced to various South African genres by my parents. For example, mbaqanga is one important sound that I grew up with, but also many other sounds in SA. So that's more my sort of like personal relationship, because I would say from maybe more my late teens, even though I was, still a student, it was more the relationship transitioning from a personal relationship to the music to a more professional relationship to music, but still very much, rooted in South African music. And when I was studying, South African house, was the sound. The parties that I went to, you'd hear, albums like Fresh House, and there was like a compilation of, Fresh House flavors from like 1 till 6, and various other sounds. While in fashion school, I studied fashion design. I then almost got reintroduced to bubblegum music, and that was through the album covers. So I came across a number of stores in Durban CBD that were selling bubblegum, this sort of like 80s sound, and I was really drawn to like the visual language and aesthetic, and started to collect these records for the reasons, obviously, of the way they looked, but then I started to listen to them, and then I fell in love with the music. And I think it's that point that I became a collector of music. And then through my practice as part of Bubblegum Club, which is a cultural organization that has like a public publishing division, but we also engage in other initiatives and projects, so curatorial projects, creative projects, artistic projects, events. And in my role at Bubblegum, I had to be a tastemaker of sorts when it came to South African music. And I also had to be a storyteller and a reporter, a publisher on South African music. And even, I guess, not a philosopher, but someone who could like speculate on possibilities around the sounds, and also contextualizing these sounds. So through my practice at Bubblegum, I've been involved in various storytelling projects. So for example, we did a mini documentary on the history of house music in South Africa. We also did a mini series on Gqom music called Gqom Origins, and we interviewed a number of the early creators of Gqom music. Yeah, so that's kind of my relationship to the music on a personal and also professional point of view.
Yeah, and actually, Bubblegum Club was my connection to South African contemporary music. And how did you get into and onto music?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Thelma Ndebele, as Izzy introduced me earlier. I DJ and practice artistically as dormant youth. I am a DJ and I am an architect by trade, and I've recently started, being comfortable with calling myself an interdisciplinary artist, simply because of the outputs that both DJing and architecture produce, that I produce as both of those things, are artistic outputs, both visually, installative, and music. So my journey actually with DJing, I think that's the easiest way to get back to South African music, is I started DJing within queer spaces, specifically through an organization called Pussy Party, who were championing the increase of number of DJs who are not cisgender, white or male in South Africa, which you would think would be kind of logical to have more people of color and more femme people DJing in such a context that is black and that is in Africa, but that's not the case. So through this organization, we were mostly looking at electronic music that was super contemporary, super international, and music that we wouldn't hear in the club in any case. That was from female rap to ballroom to Jersey club and things like Chicago footwork, which was my intro into DJing. That was the sound that made me want to dance. It made me want to mix. So hearing the repetitive percussive elements, it took me back to just like music I would hear playing in like my father's bedroom or in the living room with the big sound system and the TV, where we would just be hearing African drum patterns, just drum patterns and drum patterns. So subconsciously I'd made that connection in the back of my head. But then while performing in clubs and queer spaces, you would kind of see how the room reacts to the music you're playing. And there wasn't a contextual connection back when I started DJing in 2018. Like there'd be a few people who would know what the sound you're playing is, but it wouldn't connect to local South Africans. So I, as a DJ, would have to switch up my approach, switch up my connection of different music on the dance floor to activate it. This led me to digging deeper into local music from people around me who were in Johannesburg at the time. Artists that were making music, people like Zia or X14, people like Big Space, who were also in this cusp of making extremely international sounding music, but with an African twist. So from their experimentation, I was able to dig deeper and find genres like Gqom. And Gqom has become a cornerstone and a huge part of my DJ sets going forward. I would think out of an hour, I would play 40 minutes of just Gqom and then still have, the kind of initial influential genres I would play like ballroom and Jersey club before and after that. So when it comes to actually speaking about South African music in my practice, now as an organizer with the Groove Biennale Festival, which is a music and architecture festival, we champion first and foremost South African performers, queer performers, and then we like to introduce this element of international exchange with people from New Jersey, where Jersey Club is from, people from Baltimore, where Baltimore is from, and where Jersey Club also evolved from. And then also, getting more into diasporic sounds like UK grime, UK gqom as well, which they've started experimenting with, as well as ballroom. I'm not sure what else I can add, but maybe an interesting tidbit. The first CD I ever bought, I was born in 1995, so I'm quite young. The first CD I ever bought was called Escaleni Volume 4 by a wildly influential and prominent house music producer called DJ Cleo in South Africa, who was very much part of the group of artists and music producers who took the sound of bubblegum, kwaito, and then Durban house and made that into one of the most South African sounding and South African feeling electronic genres. And then from Durban house, you would get people making music or trying to make iterations of that, which I believe is where GOM itself evolved from. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, these were the times where we bought CDs. Yeah, let's get into some more critical framing. Yeah, it's about streaming. As I said in the intro, like Spotify celebrates for, let's say, marketing reasons, Durban as the mother of music. But yeah, where does the value land actually? Yeah. Did you see the campaign? Or yeah. What do you think about this? Is this like celebration, or is it more commodification?
That's a very good conversation that I'm glad we're starting to have publicly, because in South Africa we have quite a precarious economy, especially when it comes to art and who gets to produce art and whose art gets platformed. Of course, we know it costs money to do a lot of those things, and money that artists in South Africa don't necessarily have access to. We don't usually have, government-funded initiatives or non-profit organizations who have capacity to support just a vast amount of talent, first of all, and also to build infrastructure for us to use and to get to platform ourselves. So brand involvement is one of the easiest, one of the fastest, and one of the most convenient ways to get a creative project off the ground and from concept into an actual exhibition or into an event. So when Spotify steps in, it's hard to depoliticize them as an institution, as a private company with their own interests, while you as a creative are trying to do something for your own community. What I will say is a positive about these kind of brand collaborations is that the capital goes to the people who are actually doing the work, the curators. They have really good research departments that know the people to connect with in order to make these platforms happen and to credit the artists and to platform the artists that create the music. But as you say, Spotify, as you can see, Spotify would make more money. They would have more of a platform at the end of the day instead of the actual artists themselves. I say this from the perspective of somebody who does work with the brands, so I might sound a bit biased, but it's also very, very evident that the way in which these initiatives are presented is always Spotify first, the logo first, and then the artist, maybe if you go to the show, because then also the content that's generated, again, is extremely branded, extremely commodified. But the silver lining is that, the artist was able to be paid fairly for once, and also that the artist has also a bit of a relationship now to the people who can actually platform their work or who can support their work if Spotify would choose to. So it is quite a complicated relationship, and in my position I would like to see the positive of it, but yeah, I'm always open to other perspectives because I know it does get very political, and especially with whatever else these companies are involved with, it also starts to you also have to start to contest with how that makes you look to be associated with them. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you contextualize the campaign? Because I wasn't aware of the campaign, so when you were asking,
It was this summer. There was a big campaign on Spotify. Let's say worshipping GOM, making playlists. But this was a big visibility, let's say, and this might be empowering, but is it also extractive?
Just a little bit of more context to the events themselves or the campaign itself is Spotify commissioned a few playlists from a few artists, like Isi said. And on top of that, in 2 cities, they had 1 weekend, 3-day weekend of events in Johannesburg celebrating Amapiano music and Amapiano artists, which in my opinion, they didn't really need to, because Amapiano is its own machine and its own kind of entity that doesn't need too much platforming at this point, but I digress. And then they also had a second edition in Durban where they were picking up again on the resurgence of Gqom, simply also from the underground events that are happening in Joburg, in Durban, celebrating the genre despite of Amapiano's conglomerate over the mainstream kind of airplay and international spotlight. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have so much to say about it, because I think it's pretty obvious, you know, that the relationship is not on equal footing, and that so much more of the power lies with Spotify. I've had also through Bubblegum many experiences of working with brands, and the reason why they did that, I think fundamentally they have an agenda, and their agenda is related to signing up as many people as possible and making as much money down the road as possible. But I would say, like you were saying, you know, knowing people who do work at Spotify Africa, I guess, they do love the music. And although, you know, there was an agenda fundamentally to make profits, I think they also have an interest in the music. Yeah, that's why I said I don't have much to say on it, but yeah, that's...
But in the context of this event and the notion of black sound and white ears, I think that my work is looking at this larger relationship between black music and this kind of Western colonial machine. And through DJ scholarship, I feel like I have been looking at patterns, right? So I didn't really speak about my connection to South African house enough in the beginning, but I want to say that I visited for the first time in 2001, and then I went back in 2013, and I was in conversation with local DJs, and we exchanged music, because one thing they said to me regularly is that, in the townships, very specifically in the 1980s, they were listening to a lot of house music. There was a song in particular, Frankie Knuckles, the whistle song, and they were calling it gangster music, which I appreciate, because it's like, yes, that's fine. Queers are gangster. We can get it. But the thing is, so we were exchanging music, and I was very excited because I would go back to whatever city I was living in at the time in 2013, Atlanta, and I'd be playing like some of the songs that I collected, and I was invited to go to Soul Candy Records. Soul Candy Records in the 2000s, just an incredible, deep, soulful house sound. But the thing that I noticed in terms of this colonial machine and this overall sort of economy or political economy of black music is that these patterns were interesting. I noticed that as a person who recently wrote a biography on a blues woman, that shortly following the so-called abolishment of slavery, while convicting black folks who were in that real interesting moment between captivity and freedom, there were a number of people who were criminalized and they would be sent to prisons. One thing that ethnographers in particular would do, folklorists, they would go into, or music executives, they would go into the prisons and record songs of people who had no rights. Sometimes they would pay them with alcohol. Sometimes they would not pay them at all, right? And then I noticed just like a kind of similar approach to black music globally, where, yes, we're thinking about mining and extraction, but I just want to be honest about the fact that black music is a natural resource that has also been exploited. I would even go as far as saying that the global Western music industry is built on a plantation model, built on a colonial model, built on an apartheid model. So black extraction, black exploitation, the use of black labor to produce white wealth. But I think that the importance of talking about black sound and white ears as a kind of inversion of Frantz Fanon's black faces white mask, or black face white mask, is that it's a kind of if you all aren't familiar with that, it's a text by Frantz Fanon who talks about the internalization of white supremacy, the deep desire to be white, and to be white is to have access and to be seen and to be whole. But to think about the reverse of that and thinking about the kind of energy that is gained from Black music, desire for Black bodies and Black sound, and then also the hyper production of it where you're benefiting from it, not just financially, but also socially, right? So I live in Amsterdam. Really, I don't know if I can enter a cafe and not hear Black music. I've gone to Paris. I don't know if I can go into these spaces and not hear Black people on the walls, invisible, while hyper xenophobic discourse is taking place about sending people home. The music remains to be the sort of factor that gives them the cultural capital that they need to be seen as Paris, as London, as super progressive cities. They continue to use Black sounds for white ears to validate a kind of cool factor. And so I noticed that about South Africa, and so I started a series of mixtapes called House Music. It was called the Afro Digital Migration, and it was about house music in a post-apartheid context. And I had to really be careful about my position as a Black person from the West. So certainly part of what I did is wrote my own liner notes based on my observations and made those clear connections between Black America and Black South Africans. And not just listening to the music because I enjoyed it, but understanding how the legacies of apartheid defined things like who had access to studios, who had publishing rights, who works in record companies, who writes those liner notes, who removes the sort of important historical context that should be attached to even house music. And so that series, now there are 3 of them, really had like over 10,000 listeners of mainly South Africans. For me, I was like happy to be seen by South Africans and not a part of a global machine that's constantly extracting. And that was in 2013, where I was like, we have to talk about South Africa, the legacies of apartheid that show up in the music industry. And still, how Black people persist and create some of the most, I think that like South African sound for me, I don't understand why I am so deeply connected to it. But when I heard Amapiano, my life changed. And it changed so much because I went into the pandemic listening to it in 2019 or through 2020. I was listening to it and I was moved by the fact that there were so many songs and albums being produced like monthly by groups. I was like, yo, like this is something I've never seen. So prolific. It was so prolific that the moment the doors opened for us to move around, I moved to Johannesburg because of Amapiano. I was like, I need to go where the bass is. I need to follow the bass.
And may I ask, did you think about putting your series on Spotify to give it more visibility?
Oh,
so a bit back to like this frame.
No, but it ended up being on Apple Music, which is the same machine. I just think that I think that Spotify is just up there with like Microsoft and Apple and these folks who are in, having folks like mining for cobalt and like we are, I think that it's such a massive matrix that it's hard to get out of. Like I'm currently trying to think about how I'm going to transfer my playlist from Spotify to some other, maybe to Tidal because it's Black owned, but still participating in some of these exploitive practices.
And Jamal, may I ask you how you see this, like gaining big visibility when you are part of such a campaign? How do you see this, or how would you balance it out?
Yeah, I guess it's compartmentalizing as a way to, or strategy to just survive, get through life. Yeah, it's understanding the context within which I'm operating. So, I mean, are you specifically referring to maybe doing like brand work or, like?
Yeah, I would say as an artist. Yeah.
Yeah, as an artist, like I said, it's compartmentalizing. It depends on what I'm doing, what the intention of what I'm doing is. But like you're saying, it's Lene said it's such a deep matrix, that we find ourselves in. We could start to have conversations about like social media. I think it's the same machine. I use, platforms like Instagram. I had used Facebook in the past and X, etc., etc. Yeah, it's a complicated question. Yeah, maybe I'll try to make some notes and maybe I can come back to it if there's something I can kind of think about to, yeah, maybe speak to the strategies. But yeah, on a top level, definitely it's, yeah, compartmentalizing as a strategy.
Thank you. If would someone like to add something to the Spotify topic?
Yeah, I think while Jamal was speaking, definitely compartmentalization is the best strategy. And also keeping in mind that these brands are using diversity to make themselves look good. So you too can use the brand as a means to an end. However that looks for you is something that you would have to decide for yourself as an artist, of course. But yeah, like in spaces where you are being exploited, I think it becomes kind of neutral ground for you to also, take what you can get as much as you can live with, but also without trying, like damaging your community at the same time, which is a delicate act, a delicate balance. But, there's a way to, work with the devil,
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think it is interesting that artists like Bjork, are removing their discographies, their catalogs. I think those are great actionable moments because, but part of why she did that and a lot of other artists did that is because of Spotify's involvement with Israel, which I think is not a much more important, but an important line of thought that we should follow, right? Because Spotify, Meta, Apple, Microsoft, Delta Airlines, like so many companies and corporations and brands were invested in what we just saw and will continue to see, because I don't know what a ceasefire means when it's on Western terms. But Spotify and these different platforms had their hands in this recent genocide. And also the multiple genocides, right? Not just in Palestine. Obviously, like these machines, these brands are fueled by African resources. So that includes material and people, right? Financial and human resources to even make the genocide possible, but then also to make the brand visible, right? Through sound. So yeah, I think that these corporations have blood in their hands across the board, participating in hyper surveillance, technology, and a massive matrix. And I think the super super dark side of that is what we saw, right, with Palestine versus what we didn't see in the Congo, but was happening in Sudan. But Spotify is all up in that as well. So yes, they're exploiting and extracting and also participating in ethnic cleansing.
Just to add on what Thelma was saying, so like you were saying, you're aware of the relationship with the brand, and then you make the best that you can in that relationship. But I also think it's approaching things very differently when you are working outside of those contexts. So for example, when you're self-initiating projects and working with your peers where there is a more symmetric relationship, you hold your peers to different standards that you would hold the corporations to. You have a different relation. I think there's a lot more kindness, when interacting, and relating and collaborating with peers who are, in the same position that you're in. So yeah, I would say that's part of the compartmentalization that I was kind of referring to earlier. But it's definitely, just having a different set of ways of engaging with your peers rather than with the brands. And I think in different ways, you know, I think it's always good to hold people to high standards, but it's holding the brands to high standards in a different way to holding your peers to, as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to dive a bit into ideas on how to build worlds and keep value local and on credit lineage and and of course with a focus on authorship and local ecosystems and counter infrastructure. Linné, looking at your projects, what are replicable methods that we could use maybe even in clubs or at festivals?
An applicable what, I'm sorry?
Methods.
Methods. Applicable methods? Well, I mean, I just want to say this, especially again, as a non-South African, I think was hugely important to realize about Black music, and I would even say globally, is that the level of innovation outpaces the Western machine. I mean, it just outpaces it. So what I mean by that is, I didn't hear it come until 2018, and I thought, there's no others. Now I'm addicted to this sound, right? Meanwhile, I'm 5 years late, to it. So even I on this kind of, so locally, you talk about that you've been collecting for years before I even heard it, right? And I think that represents an important kind of method of, I like to call it Black privacy, right? It's which is a hugely important commodity, Black privacy. No matter what, the Western machine cannot keep up. Yes, they are exploitive. By the time they get these new sounds, those sounds are old, and the next sound is being developed. So you kind of almost are not able to catch it in real time because it hasn't been created yet, and it'll be created tomorrow. When the machines and the cameras and the equipment is not there, and the music develops from that case. But in terms of method, I mean, I think, say for example, Black music, literature, and scholarship by Black artists is a real important method to kind of preserve the integrity and intention of these spaces without being indebted to universities, per se. I think that this method of challenging former narratives and thinking about narrative as a tool of white supremacy and challenging it by writing your own stories and writing about your people's music and is a method for us to kind of think about applying, write our own stories about the music. Because historically, if you were to just choose a country, let's just even say Nigeria in the 1970s and the funk movement that happened there and the many albums that are available, if you go and dig through those crates and look at those albums and flip them over and see who distributed those albums, oftentimes you'll find Holland, you'll find France, you'll find London, and then they become responsible for writing the story of that music through the liner notes, which is the music or the text that appears as a part of the album, right? And that text is deeply political, is deeply important, and what people decide to focus on when talking about the music is important. So say, for example, in South Africa, when there was a massive campaign of censorship, meaning SABC would literally listen closely to many South African albums, and if they heard anything that they thought might inspire rebellion, they literally physically scratched the song out, right? And they were also the ones who were writing about the music. So if there were references about owning land, they would change that context, right? And talk about it as being some kind of benign, oh, we love the land versus we want land, right? So I think being part of the entire production and the narrative and the ideology behind the sound and the production is important.
Yeah, and maybe both of you, you Dormitius with Groove Biennale, you Jamal with Bubblegum Club and the gallery, you created such self-publishing or own platforms. So maybe you could give us some insight from your projects also on the motivation, but also on the struggle when you are having those independent platform.
Maybe I'll go ahead just because there was something about method that I kind of wanted to say and something that I was thinking about. I think in relation to many South African sounds, but Gom is one such example. And you realize, there's the context with which Gom is created, and then there's the context in which it travels. And you see the difference when it's in this sort of like second context, when it's being consumed by maybe people outside the context and it's sort of traveling. You see how different the intention and method is. And just one such example is how, so you have like home producers, and they were super prolific, producing sometimes tens of tracks a day, let's say. They're producing the tracks so fast, and also this is that's a method thing as well. It's like a collective practice. So many of the people who produce Gom produce in groups. So you'll find 5 or 10 people in one room producing one track. So authorship is, the idea of authorship is very different to authorship in like Western context, let's say. And there's many of these other differences that you see in method. And you see when the music is released, the music, sometimes it's untitled, and it gets lost or maybe the people who are receiving it now, like let's say you've come across this MP3, it's maybe just the date that it was exported. You love the sound, you have no idea, but I feel like in a European context, I heard an interview with, I think a record label owner from London, and he just, he couldn't understand that, he had all of these files that were like untitled just by the date, but that were like incredibly like creative sound. He couldn't understand that this he had all of these MP3s, like come to him in whatever way that it did. But I think that's just such an example of the differences between like the context and the method, which underpins the production in Durban, let's say, for Gom, and all of the places in which Gom was exported to. People couldn't understand it. And as we were speaking about method, I kind of really thought about like these two almost opposite ways of thinking about like production, thinking about like ownership, and various other things. Yeah.
I have a little technical request from our fantastic translators. Thank you very much. That we keep the microphones at our chins. Sorry to. So let's talk about getting autonomous with self-publishing, with making our own festivals. How does it feel in South Africa, in Johannesburg, especially? I know you work with sponsors also. Maybe you could give us a bit of input on your motivation, but also on your struggle.
Sure. I think I started Groove Biennale as a personal kind of goal to create a space for my master's research to physically live. So when I was studying architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, I was looking specifically at nightlife in Joburg because the city itself already during the day is incredible. It's in flux. So many people come in, so many people go out. So many things are exchanged, so many things stay, so many things leave, so many things are brought in. So this kind of attitude and this condition, this nervous condition, also exists and permeates at night, but at night it becomes this beautiful space to cultivate community, to cultivate interesting art outputs, visual art, musical art, interdisciplinary, installative art. So when I was researching like the movement of all of these interesting phenomena and the people that make them, I thought that, okay, cool, I've seen and tested the theory. So let me make a physical space that these tests can play out, and are these conditions and these choreographies something that can be manufactured? You know, is this something that we as the people that enact them consciously, subconsciously, can we make this a product? Can we make this something for ourselves that we experience on our own terms and not waiting for another brand, an outside brand, to make a festival for us, to then book us at that festival for us to attend? So, and then, it costs so much to do things. That's the one thing I've learned from all of these endeavors. It is amazing to have an idea and a concept and people believe in it, but to physically build it, capitalism did a number on us. So, it goes back to then, how do we build this? There's only so much you can do as an underrepresented or an underprivileged identity and an underprivileged individual in a country that is already kind of unequal. It goes back to then working with brands. It goes back to then how do you negotiate between what the brand can say about this project and how much the brand owns of this project, how much of it can it still be community-based or community-led if there's other people involved supporting the idea in more ways than one, But then at that level of production, there are all those problems, but at the level of the curation and the programming, there is at least some room to then give back some of that power to the initial idea and the initial driving force of making these spaces exist. That then means that as the curator or the programmer of the festival, I have the opportunity to book my friends, people that I believe have something really important to contribute. And it's not also necessarily nepotism through and through, but these are people that are actually talented, but I just happen to know personally as well. So I think, if I'm not digressing too much, I think the kind of idea that retaining a lot of ownership around at least public programming and the curating of these festivals that are self-made but have other components and other external institutions involved is that I can at least still say, okay, these South African artists are non-negotiable. They have to be on the lineup. These South African, how do I say, subcontractors, suppliers. These suppliers are South African. We have to work with them first. These are queer women that do event awareness. We have to have them here. You need to give me a budget for awareness, So, these kind of self-authored spaces are important in keeping the integrity of the kind of space you're trying to cultivate.
Thank you very much for your work with this platform. And Jamal, would you like to also give us some insight on what practices many with partners work and where you have to be very critical and stop it?
Okay, maybe I'll just start with briefly giving the reasons why we started Bubblegum. So we started Bubblegum to bring visibility to different groups of people who had been marginalized, whether it was for race, gender, politics, or the type of work that they were producing. So people who were working maybe in non-traditional ways, and I think this also very much connects to other reasons why they'd be excluded, for example, race, but people who were working non-traditionally and also intersectionally as well. So we wanted to sort of bring visibility to these groups of people, and part of that was to create or to experiment with an approach to being independent in a context like South Africa. So you could see bubblegum as an experiment in itself on how to be an independent practitioner. And part of that was about framing like these marginalized practices, or these practices that were outside of the traditional institutions, framing them, reporting on them, reflecting on them as a way to sort of like shine this spotlight, but also, yeah, I guess to build a community, networks of support, strength in numbers, in order to have some sort of like leverage and power when it comes to operating in more commercial spaces, let's say, or engaging with institutions, let's say. And I feel like it was a fairly successful like approach to creating this dynamic or this relationship with brands and institutions, let's say, because we weren't approaching it, even though, let's say, someone who had been featured on Bubblegum gets an opportunity with a brand. You get that opportunity, but now you almost have this community backing you up, or your work is contextualized in a different way, and it kind of brings more weight and support also in these interactions. So that's sort of like what our relationship has been like with brands and institutions, and also what's been so successful. And I guess you're doing very much a similar thing in building. It's an exercise in like building institutions, because I think that's one of the major challenges we have, especially for people who've been otherwise not included, in institutions, is that it's a lot more difficult to engage with an institution as an individual rather than as part of something, even if it's very defined or even not so defined.
I think on a maybe from a different angle, and even thinking about method, as someone who is now an official, Dutch resident, I don't even know what, but anyway, as someone who is a resident, no, I'm not a Dutch resident, I'm a resident in the Netherlands, and one thing, because I don't think I really do well with institutions, and I'm at Goldsmiths University in London, which means I am like having to deal with an institution. To some degree, I have independence because it's a PhD, but what I will say is that with the Dutch in particular, they have a really interesting kind of approach to supporting the arts financially. And so I really put a lot of work, I would even consider it a part-time job, into fundraising for myself to create my own events, but to partner with already established Black organizations in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. Those are two examples. And so I work closely with the Library of Things We Forgot to Remember in Johannesburg, owned by a visual artist by the name of Kutsi, but also he's Zimbabwean, so then there's an interesting, very important diasporic element to it. And I get the Dutch to pay us to do that work in their absence. I am not accountable to them. Thank you for the money. Yes, this is how I spent it, but that's fine. I can tell you how I spent it, but you owe us this money. You owe this money. And also, again, I am someone who can move with a U.S. passport throughout the world, without, and not in the same way that Southern Africans or folks on the continent in general can. I have a whole lot more access. The least I can do is to pour into those institutions. And so I do that. I go to, where I live in Johannesburg, I organize many events at that library, and I pay artists to be in conversation with each other, with me, but then I also hire folks to film it and pay South Africans to film it. I'll hire like South African writers to do the text or to be moderators. And then I do the same thing in Cape Town with Chimaringa, and I work closely with Ntone and Chimaringa. If you're not familiar, please look them up. It's a research library, it is a publishing house, it is they call it a Pan-African space station online radio program. And then they also host events, and so I've hosted many events with Intone. But yeah, getting that Dutch money and putting it in in the country, putting it back into the country so that folks can maintain a kind of autonomy within that and therefore dignity. But it doesn't mean that you are, undignified if you are working directly with those institutions. If anything, I commend your ability to do that work. And I know that you have to do work to protect your spirits when working with these institutions that don't love us. So yeah, I think working with Black institutions, if possible, and getting Europe to pay for it is a great method.
But yeah, we know this concept, and we are lucky to know this concept, that we, for certain projects, can avoid getting in contact with exploitive sponsorships. There are institutions like Pro Helvetia, Goethe Institute, and so on, that offer also subsidies for the local artists of South Africa or cultural workers. But who gets access to this information? Do young GOM producers in the suburbs of in the townships around Durban, do they know about that they would or should have access to such offers?
That's a very good point you're bringing up, because, with the kind of exposure that you would have as an individual, I think it's important to also do community work in going to the actual producers of the music that the DJs at my festival would play. I think Pro Helvetia has a couple of programs, maybe the research trip or the co-creation program, which is a little bit complicated to get. But, the programs do exist. But like you're saying, the access or even the knowledge from trying to get it from Joburg to Durban or to Umlazi, which is a very small township just outside of the metropolitan area of Durban, is extremely difficult for no apparent reason. I think I'm not even sure what to blame apart from apartheid spatial planning, because without the physical geographic access to an urban center, that kind of knowledge starts to become arcane and only for a specific group of people for some reason. And like the producers themselves, some of them are quite young, don't even have a passport, let alone, stable internet all the time to be able to be surfing on websites and platforms like On the Move or Pro Helvetia specifically. So it is quite difficult, and maybe it's something my festival can start doing, having a workshop specifically for, arts funding, international arts mobility funding, just general project funding access, yeah.
Yeah, and then let's say artists, or first their music, and then the artist may travel to show their work. But what happens then when, what happens when you play a GOM DJ set in a London club? How is it? Yeah, do the people know what GOM is? What do you do to tell the story of GOM? Is it just a feeling?
I'm laughing because amongst a couple of friends of mine, DJ friends and producers, is this joke that, you can play the most fun, interesting electronic music set, or you could just literally request a microphone at a big club in Europe, and then for the whole hour just read the names of the producers, and that's your whole performance, to maybe try and contextualize what's going on, because the sound itself is infectious. It is extremely innovative and futuristic and mind-blowing, but it doesn't necessarily move European bodies the way it moves South African bodies. And that disconnect is always funny for me to see and experience, because I'm like, what are you doing? You can't catch the beat. But, you know, it's also a big ask if you don't know what the beat is supposed to be doing. So I don't know. I think maybe we can be a bit more experimental with how we present the music, and yeah, maybe words can help.
I mean, well, but then I just want to acknowledge that there are Black people in Europe, right? So so the reason why like Amapiano was so deep to me, and I was in Durban in 2018 and I heard it I was in Durban in 2018 and I heard and I was like, oh my God, right? But then when I heard Amapiano, I took it with me into the pandemic. But when I came outside and I was living in London at the same time, there were massive Amapiano parties in London, massive Amapiano parties in Amsterdam and in Paris and in Brussels and in LA and in New York. And I've never seen South African music take on that kind of global presence. And let me just not say global, African diasporic presence. Because in those places that I just named, those were majority Black and Caribbean, African and Caribbean parties in London. So I wanted to talk about the music a little bit, because I think that Amapiano is, I would say, up there with like funk, up there with jazz, up there with, soul. I think it's one of the most important sonically healing forms of music, because one thing that I know and witnessed Amapiano do, because the bass drops so low in ways that we have not seen before, to the point where speakers are not aware of how to hold it, and the bass is unruly, right? Like that is what I saw. I saw Black folks healing through that bass, through those speakers, on those dance floors, mainly in the absence of white Europeans in Europe. So that is something that I just want to sit with, like, because I don't even know that, like, I know the South Africans, because when I go back there, they're like, what, are you serious? No, what do you mean? No, I've seen people, like, gather around the base of Amapiano. Frequency levels, there is something healing about what that bass did and does for Black people globally, period, right? And I feel like there's a lot of emphasis on what Black American music does, on, for jazz and soul and all of these things, but I've not in my life witnessed anyone move like that by Amapiano. I didn't see that happen with Gqom. I didn't see that happen with South African House. I didn't see that happen with, Kwaito. I'm old enough to have seen that. The only thing we had was Brenda Fassie in terms of bubblegum, but Amapiano is a whole other planet of Black sound that we all wanted to visit.
So the magic, the feeling, the healing is there and it stays. But Jamal,
it's private.
Yeah, ownership. But what gets lost when music travels and gets out of its like social, linguistic, and also political context? Jamal, maybe you could jam on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I touched on it a little bit earlier when discussing like the method and the two different contexts and the ways in which, I guess, music is produced. What gets lost? I mean, I think it's also difficult to be in the position of maybe the Western context, let's say, or any context outside of South Africa to try and reflect on what gets lost or how people receive the music. Maybe it's something that I can think about. You'll come back to me. Yeah.
I wanted to add, maybe on a bit more technical side, is from my experience, Amapiano, when it leaves South Africa, changes, like the performance speed changes. Amapiano is produced typically between 110 and 115 BPM. But from, the videos you would see online that go viral, and from other DJs I would see playing it that aren't South African, who just like the sound and can relate to the musicality, they'd play it much faster. maybe 120, 122 BPM. So now it starts to revert back to house music, you know. It's still groovy because it's still amapiano, and the pockets that each beat and each log drum that they hit is still quite uniquely South African. But the speed and the groove is slightly adapted to like maybe a European pace, if I can say that. In South Africa, on many dance floors, the entire ethos is the aim is not to sweat. That is like one of the things that has come out of South African dance floors is you have to be smooth, you have to be easy, you have to groove with the sound, you know, move your whole body. It's not just like, you know, a 4 on the floor stomp, you know, you have to feel it. It's a hip thing, it's a shoulder thing, it's a back thing, you know, it's a waist thing. So I'm really happy to hear, Lene Denise, you when you're explaining how you've experienced it, that the kind of magic still translates, even though the technicality of it changes slightly. It adapts slightly to the different context. I think what gets lost in that instance then is the kind of ease of the music. The music, as complicated and intricate as each, you know, percussion is supposed to be and is meticulously planned to be, because South Africans are just inherently quite musical people. That ease and the kind of being able to digest what each pocket is doing gets lost when you speed it up, when you lose the negative space, when you lose the quiet, and when you kind of cut that very personally annoying long breakdown in the middle where there's no bass, no sound, where you're kind of supposed to breathe with other people, where you can kind of get out of your steps that you're dancing, because amapiano is also very foot heavy. Like there's a lot of footwork involved in the dancing, that you can kind of like regain your breath. You can kind of look up, smile with your friends, say hi to the person that just joined the circle. And then when the beat comes back, we all go back to dancing, you know. Yeah, there's that kind of, I don't know how to term that entire interaction that gets lost when you speed up the music. Yeah.
And I guess it also depends on where you are in Europe and who's speeding it up, because there are many Black DJs in the West who understand the importance, because I just said this to Jamal yesterday, another reason why not only do I live in Joburg but plan to stay there long term is because South Africans respect varying modes of tempo. So you don't have to speed it up, right? Because then people have the dance and the moment and they're ready. You don't have to speed it up. But then you also have Black DJs that say, like, that are in London that come out of a dub tradition. They're not trying to speed it up. In fact, they're like, oh, this is speaking to me. Or, you know, like, yeah, so I just think that nuance around thinking about Black folks in the West becomes super important, because it is a way for us to truly connect diasporically. But I think what's real interesting is that we have no idea of what the lyrics are saying. So that's really, talk about what gets lost, because and the fact that I memorized the lyrics and I don't speak the language. And so I'd be like saying something and my friend was like, do you know what you just said? I'm like, what? And they were like, you just said that you prefer to take home 8 women at a time. I'm like, no, 5, but not 8. No, honestly. No, but you know what I'm saying? Of like what literally gets lost in translation in the language, although I hear it sonically and I love the phrasing. But like, yeah, but I think that it really does depend on place, and with those, like in the diaspora, like how those people are playing the music is oftentimes connected to their kind of sonic identities. So it's not always at that 120, but like I can imagine in Germany it would be. I can see that being like a commitment of like, let's speed it up, let's move it along, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I think, going back to Gqom from Amapiano, just because I've experienced Gqom in a Western setting, I think the one thing is joy. And if you speak to a lot of Gqom producers, they'll mention about how the sound, they create the sound to bring joy to people, to take away any sadness, distress, those sorts of feelings. And I think being in a Western context and being in a South African context where Gqom is being played, you really see how Gqom brings this like visceral joy to people. People move in this way. And in a European context, I didn't feel, this sort of like visceral joy. I think people were enjoying and vibing to the music, but yeah, maybe it didn't have this like almost spiritual sort of response to the music, sort of like visceral joy, letting go completely with the body. Yeah.
When you say, no, I'm just curious if you witness Black people in the West respond with joy. No, you didn't.
No. So it was in London, and it was like a very small underground party, and there was one other Black person besides myself. Yeah, yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, but generally, do you think, it's a super flat question, but maybe it opens to an interesting insight. Should Amapiano pace be kept, or would you say like, yeah, it's their loss, they lose the magic, take it as you can?
That's a very good question. I think, in my personal opinion, I am one of those people that preferred faster. And the earlier the earlier statement was something I've been made privy to, something that's been exposed to me when I play Amapiano fast. That it has been not only a critique that I've received as like, yo, like, what are you doing, DJ? We know the song is supposed to be slow. We can't dance the way we wanted to the song because you want to hear it a certain way, because when I play, my sets climb. I start 125 minimum, and I want to end at jungle, which is 170. So I don't have time to be starting at 110. So yeah, I think as myself looking at the way I practice and the way I DJ, that was a critical reflection that I'm starting to take on as well, which is why I no longer play Amapiano, because I feel like I'm disrespecting the person that wants to hear it. But I digress. I think, it has to then depend on the dance floor. If it's in the daytime and you're at a shisanyama, that's one of the words, like a barbecue, like an outdoor barbecue, that's typically located next to a car wash in a township in South Africa, I can see 100% why you would want Amapiano to be played quite slow. It's very relaxing. You're not going there to sweat. You're there to have a good time while you're getting your errands out of the way, and you're having food, and you're communing with people. But if you're in a dark room, you're in a club, it's 2 a.m., and the party is going, I can 100% see why you would play Amapiano at 120 BPM, because the energy is up there with you, and the sound is still interesting enough to keep people around on the dance floor. Yeah.
Jamal, would you like to add something to the tempo topic?
I mean, I'm not a DJ or music producer or anything like that, and I don't really, look out or listen out for these sorts of things. But as you were speaking, Thelma, I was wondering, why would people want to change the tempo to begin with? It was just a question that came to me. Is it could it be for the purposes of developing the sound in a way? Is it a kind of remixing or tweaking the sound? Or is it just like, oh, this doesn't suit me, And I think those, if you think about it in that way, it's a maybe interesting way to think about it, and might open up bigger questions and conversations when it comes to asymmetries and everything that we've been discussing, between, a South African context and Western context.
I think as a DJ, I think some of it also might be generational, because quite honestly, we were called out if we adjusted the tempo of the song so much that we took it out of its original frame. You would be judged. Have some discipline is what we would be told. Have some discipline, because then it requires that you dig through the crates of other genres of music in that same tempo. And by tempo, I mean, I'm just talking like maybe go up, maybe it's 85 and you go up to 90. Maybe it's 90 and you go down to 85, but 85 to 125 is, that's remixing, right? So I think that it might be generational in that and innovative, I guess, in a kind of development too, but I do feel like we were like, but that also meant we were playing for close listeners. That's the difference. And if you are playing in a place where you're introducing the sound and people don't know, that's a different thing. But when people are at home also listening and then they come and they're like, hold on, that's not even the situation. Yeah.
We were now talking for 1.5 hours. I would also like to give space to the public that was listening until now to ask questions, to open the discussion. But maybe first, I have a wishing round for you. If you would have a wish to change little thing in contracts, in curation, or even in metadata, what would it be that could shift value back? If you could make a change, would you see one single change we could make now to shift back the value to the artist this year?
I think for me, something that's already been happening because of Amapiano artists and how many of them are on a track just on any given day. There's usually maybe 3, 4, 5 names of producers listed and credited. I would continue that, and maybe like on your music player app or on your display, I would make that space for the artist a bit bigger so that you don't have to wait for it to scroll all the way to the end to see everybody. It might be a lot more like to take in to read, but I think it's worth it because the songs are also like 7 minutes long, to read everybody's name first up front without having to wait for the last person's name. Yeah, really tiny.
Could be made easily.
For me, it would be relooking the way that we value music from a monetary perspective, because I don't think the value that music adds to people's lives, the value that South African electronic music adds to people's lives is valued correctly. And I think someone mentioned earlier, like Spotify paying, I think it was you, Lene, Spotify paying a fraction, or was it Thelma? Yeah, like paying fractions, So how do we, revalue music from like a monetary perspective? But it's not like one element of the contract, I guess. But I think that would really help, so people can be fairly paid with the work they produce, because it's difficult to, for example, look at GOM. Look at the GOM producers, DJs who have made a decent living. I think you can count them on one hand, the South African-based ones. Maybe even less. Maybe it's just 2 or 3 people who've actually been able to make a living from the sound, which is insane, That's just because, the same 1, 2, 3 DJs are being invited to tour globally, and everyone else, it's just, left with the fractions, basically. And as we've all been discussing, that these sounds are collectively created and produced, but so for me, it's rethinking how we value, so that the money can find, there can be 3 people touring, but how can more money flow to the producers?
I think So maybe even to take a moment to acknowledge the exhibition and the kind of intentionality behind it, and understanding that even when we're talking about house music, not even, but because we are talking about South African house music and the various subgenres from to three-step to amapiano, it's just important. I think my wish would be that people would engage music in general, but South African music, because it's like hot in the diaspora right now. Like, I wish that it would be engaged beyond its entertainment value. And like, you know, part of the exhibition includes, I think, a foundational documentary that should be watched, and that's Amandla. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. Please, for Amandla, right? Like, and it is about the history of resistance music in South Africa, which comes through jazz, which comes through bubblegum and kwaito, and these seemingly apolitical sounds that have real important political consequences. So amapiano is not apolitical, particularly when you think about how it was super prolific during the pandemic and what was happening in the country during that time with like the, what do you call that, like the alcohol restrictions, or just so many things, so much information, that if we ask ourselves what we think about the music beyond how it makes us feel, then we might find ourselves, you know, being a little more curious about the kind of geopolitical position of this bass heavy sound.
Just to add a little bit, Amapiano though was about the soft life. I think a big part of Amapiano, the soft life. Yeah, it was kind of about. Yeah, I think it comes in a moment when we were over 20 years into the new political dispensation, and maybe South Africans had a vision, a dream for what freedom would bring, and I don't think it quite materialized. It maybe materialized for a small group of people, the like black middle class, but outside of that, this dream didn't materialize. And I think Amapiano was it was a way to call out, you know, and sort of try and bring forth, you know, this like reality. But if you, especially the early Amapiano, if you like listen to it, if you see, I mean, even the moves, you know, you're speaking about, it was like sort of like slow, you know, people really vibing. It's really about like being relaxed and living a life that's not difficult, essentially. Because that's still like the reality for so many South Africans, and it wasn't the expectation that like that was going to be the reality of most of South Africans 20, 30 years into democracy, essentially. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm totally. No, I'm saying it's super political because of
Extremely, yeah.
And now, if ever there are questions, which I guess there are, yes.
There we go. Hello, I'm Pauline Mukanza, and I'm founder of the International Human Rights Music Festival. It sits on the nexus between creators like yourself and the multilateral space that we see specifically in Geneva and decision. So we aim to bring music as witness to a change within this space. And so I really want to thank you for your contributions. It's very insightful. And I appreciate echoing the need for funding in grassroots spaces and how money is a tool to create. But I particularly enjoy, in the context of white ears and black music, I particularly enjoyed when you spoke about the technicality of the BPM changing. And in my observation, I found that in a set as well, that because of capitalism, the way in which DJs perform today, we miss the drop and we go way too fast. And I wondered if you wanted to speak on that. You know, when you sit with something yourself, you might be inventing it in your head, but I wanted to see if you had a similar observation and if you would like to speak on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. Is it on? Okay, sorry. It is an interesting observation about how quickly DJs mix. I too used to mix quite quickly, but that's simply because I started mixing with Chicago footwork and mostly battle tracks, which is very quick. Like, you have to keep the beat going so that the footworkers in the middle keep dancing. And if you kind of break that rhythm, you kind of break the party in a bit of a way. So I think maybe that kind of tempo and need for tempo in some spaces can be contextual. But in the way that you'd frame your question in terms of like capitalism and songs that aren't made to be fast being played fast in the club because we just need more and more and more, and we want to play another song and another song and another song, it becomes less about curation and more about exhibiting that, oh, I have all of these songs that are popping right now, which is, it's not, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but I think there's a time and a place to be in a mood to exhibit and to showcase. And I think depending on the kind of party you throw or the kind of party that you go to, you can see, like, you'll see, like, when there's a selector, you'll see when there is somebody who's there to make people dance, and then you'll see when there's somebody that's like, okay, I'm here, I've been booked, I need to play, I'm gonna play and I'm gonna go. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question well, but yeah, in my opinion, it is a symptom of the times that we're just trying to get to the next song as soon as possible. And I'm not sure what can fix it. Maybe it's a lot more spaces, and maybe it's just a trend. Maybe we're going to get fatigued by hearing, I don't know, the same 90s nostalgia song mixed with a vocal from the 2000s, mixed with a weird 3-step remix of a song from the 1970s. You know, maybe we're just in an era that it's just trendy. Yeah, and I'm hoping we're in an era where it's just trendy and we can go back to fully listening to at least getting to after the chorus to get to the next song. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for this discussion. As a Black and queer woman, I'm very happy to have this kind of event here in Geneva in this museum. So thank you very much. My question is, I want to talk about Solomon Linda, the South African. He created music in 1939 called Mbumbe, sorry for my pronunciation, and you all know this music because it's The Lion Sleeps Tonight. The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And he received less than $2, died poor. And in 2000, South African journalist Ryan Malan investigated about Solomon Linda's story. He made a paper, a documentary, and this encouraged Solomon's family to take legal action against Disney. They win, had a compensation. So my question is, should we accept help, power, or visibility from white people? What's your opinion? Thank you very much.
So no, it's an incredible question, especially because that sound has taken on a Western identity. Right? People associate it obviously with the Lion King, but it's such an important question, and it is connected to what I talked about, that line of catastrophe between colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. Because I wrote a book, I said, about this blues musician, and you all may be very familiar with the song that Elvis Presley made famous for her, and that's Hound Dog, right? So his version of Hound Dog is still creating wealth for his family. She died poor in Los Angeles, right? So yes, I mean that is so in the US there were a team of white lawyers who approached the family of blues musicians to represent them to get that money back, to buy catalogs back, to get publishing back. And I think absolutely white folks should be using their resources, their access, their skills to help retract, retain, repair what their ancestors or what they have caused, and the material loss which contributes to psychological imbalance, which contributes to just multiple forms of stress, which then contributes to premature death, right? Or alcoholism, addiction, right? That many blues artists struggled with. So absolutely, I think that it requires allies to repair this massive damage.
Can I add that the onus and the responsibility, in my opinion, I feel shouldn't fall on Black people being the ones to ask. I think it should be a thing of white people doing their, like not their fair share, but doing some work, physical, emotional, economical work, to be the allies. It shouldn't be a thing of like always us inviting, always us bridging the gap, because there's only so much Black bodies can do or should be expected to do, yeah.
Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I just had a quick question, because we talked about white ears and Black sounds, but what about, white ears, Black sounds. What about the African ears, sorry. Personally, I found out about Amapiano in Kinshasa, DRC, and when later I went in Cape Town, I understood why, because you have like a big community of Congolese diaspora and like Congolese migration in South Africa. So I was also thinking about all the circulation between, South Africa and Europe and the US and Black diaspora, Afro-descendant diaspora around the globe, but also within the African continent, because Amapiano is popping in Abidjan, it's popping in every city of Africa. And I think maybe sometimes we just like thinking that it's went from South Africa directly to Europe. I think the diaspora and Francophone diaspora in particular played a huge role in that. So I just wanted to know if you have like some insights on this.
Do you feel like it's an issue? Okay. No.
We talked about that today, but I mean, sometimes it's just missing. It's just like you have like a big blank between South Africa and the rest of the world,
Yeah.
And we have like huge megalopolis where everything is actually moving.
Yeah, what I can say very briefly is I think it's a good thing that this dialogue is happening. I think it's very necessary. Again, I'm going to speak, I guess, a little bit or contextualize it from a position of being from South Africa. And South Africa has had many issues with xenophobia. And it's one of the just terrible like repercussions or hang-ups of apartheid, the ways in which we were just isolated from ourselves fundamentally, and this sort of like hate for people who look like us fundamentally. And I think music has been one of these things that have the potential to start dialogue, have the potential to create healing as well, in this this relationship. So one such example is the relationship between, I guess, like South Africa and Nigeria. And South Africans have a lot of stereotypes about Nigerian people, you know, this and that, etc. And you realize that like through music, and it's not just amapiano, but various other sounds like Afro-pop, what's the Nigerian Afrobeats, exactly, Afrobeats, have really brought artists together from these two different places, and yeah, done this work of like, you know, healing, repairing, restarting, you know, these relationships, creating solidarity amongst people across these like regions. So I think it's amazing that music can do that, and I hope more of that kind of happens.
I think to add on to that, from what I've seen between the pandemic up to now, especially online, I was very much on X when amapiano was starting to be like a topic of discourse. What would happen was, you know, I think from the producers that are online and kind of have a bit of a removed lens and perspective of how music moves from South Africa to the global north, is that idea again of ownership, is that when, for instance, when Gqom came out from South Africa in the 2010s and it went directly to Europe, there was some erasure of where that sound came from. And there were articles and reports and, you know, just general media talking about this new exciting sound without any context of where it came from. So that kind of sore spot was transferred when amapiano went global, and people were categorizing it with Afrobeats and saying it is just Afrobeats. It's a new version of Afrobeats, you know. And there was a bit of a kick-up between some Nigerian artists and some South African artists saying, no, you guys can't do this. This is South African. You can't claim it, blah, 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 simply because of what happened with Gqom. And I think that kind of dialogue that happened and that kind of phenomenon of maybe it felt like there was a bit of an attempt to erase the original context of amapiano of being South African to it being an African, a continental sound. And I think that's the reason why a lot of the time when we speak about amapiano, the rest of the continent kind of is like silently pushed to the side, in my opinion. That's how I read the situation. But it is very much a good exercise to recognize that, yes, Nigeria, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of the African continents around the equator were the first champions of this genre coming out of the southern region of the continent. Yeah.
I mean, so because there are two things in that question, a really good question, by the way, because, again, as a person who lives in Joburg, and I do feel some of that xenophobic heat for sure, but for also different reasons in terms of, again, being from the West, not just from the continent. So then that's another layer of tension. But I mean, yeah, so I have friends that are from Namibia, that are from Zambia, that are from Botswana, that are from Mozambique, and there's a frustration there with how they are also erased and their sounds are erased. But that gap that you're talking about, this binary between like black sound just meaning kind of diasporic, just the continent being erased historically. But that is why I continue to push to have people remember that when they are talking about Europe, they are also talking about African and Caribbean people who are there. And that's why I said, like, what I saw in Europe and the response to amapiano, I saw African people being moved in a way that I have not seen them move before by something that wasn't their own music. In London, when I lived in London, you can go to, you know, a Ghanaian club, you can go to a Nigerian club, you can hear Afrobeat, but I had not seen this deep intra-African experience that amapiano, I felt like amapiano summoned the black world through its sound And I'm saying, when I say black, I am including African folks. But yeah, I just think it's just important to like keep having the discipline to not just like understand Europe and the West as just being a solely white space. And that is something that I feel like I've had to do in South Africa. Like, nope, I beg you, please don't call me American. Like, don't leave it at American. Like, I prefer black American for a reason, because I'm treated that way and have been treated that way historically. I don't have the same access and the same privileges. But yeah, so I do think that there are real questions around xenophobia, legacies of apartheid, how we hear ourselves and each other, and the conversations we are not having with each other. But then we get online and have like this invisible white hand leading these divisive conversations without context. So I know not to leave South Africa and go to my home in LA and be like, oh, these people were mean to me and they get right. I have to actually deal with what it means to witness the legacies of apartheid and how it informs how people take possession of their things that have value, but then those things are being extracted. But then another thing is, like, I get my haircut in London, in these barbershops that are usually Nigerian, or in the Dutch context, because there's a growing population of West Africans. Now there's a thing where it's like a Mapiano music to Afrobeat lyrics, right? So there's a real interesting, and it's not a mashup. It's like what a Mapiano has done. Like, people are reproducing or localizing a Mapiano. So you go to these barbershops, listen, I'm like, wait, this is the underground of like Senegal. This is the underground of Cameroon. This is the underground, of even like Kenya, East Africa. Like, there's a conversation happening that I think we should be paying attention to, that you are bringing up, that I think is important.
But also maybe questions can't be short and answers even less. I want to say thank you to all the listeners and participants that came to the MEC today. Thank you, Dumbanengue, for setting up this round table in here in the Afrosonica exhibition of MEC, where we get context. Thank you very, very much to the three of you for the insight that you gave us, for the work that you do since forever and will keep on, for making autonomous platforms, for writing archives, for getting fair conditions in galleries and music labels. Thank you, Dumbanengue and Litu, to bring us together here. And huge thank you to the two translators that were speaking now for 2 hours and they couldn't share the speaking time.
And